The wind howled like an orphaned spirit through Devil's Jaw Canyon, tugging at the corners of the old cabin like it wanted in. The shutters creaked against warped wood, and smoke from a dying fire curled lazily upward, casting long shadows on the cracked stone hearth. Inside, Silas Granger sat hunched over a crooked piece of juniper wood, carving the shape of a horse he'd never seen but remembered in his bones. His beard was more white than gray now, tangled and wild like the thoughts he rarely spoke aloud. The whiskey bottle by his foot was half empty, or half full, depending on how close to midnight it was. He hadn't spoken to a soul in 17 days, and that had been to a coyote he'd mistaken for a lost dog. Silence suited him. Silence didn't judge, didn't scream, didn't bleed. Silence didn't call him preacher like they used to, back when blood soaked through his robes as easily as rain. Outside, the skies cracked. Thunder rolled low across the hills, and the kind of rain that came once in a season began to fall. Cold, relentless. He listened to the rhythm of it tapping the tin roof and felt, for a moment, that maybe it was trying to wash something clean. Then came the knock. Soft at first, barely there, like the sound of a dying bird hitting a window pane. Then again, frantic now. Fists too small to make noise, but desperation gave them weight. Silas stood slowly, every joint complaining. He reached for the rifle mounted above the hearth, but didn't take it down. Something about the knock. There was no demand, no threat in it, just fear. When he opened the door, the storm reached in and slapped him. A gust of wind, wet and biting, hit his chest like a curse. And there she stood. She couldn't have been more than 8. Her dress hung on her like a sack, soaked to the bone, sticking to her thin frame. Mud caked her bare feet and knees. Her lips were trembling, hair plastered to her face, snot running down her chin. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold, green as broken glass, wide as the sky before a tornado. "My mama's dying," she whispered through chattering teeth. "Please, mister." For a long moment, Silas didn't move. He stared into those eyes like they were a mirror of some ghost he'd long buried. Then he stepped aside. "Get in, girl," he muttered. She didn't thank him. She just moved past, limping slightly, hugging herself. Silas followed her out into the storm, without another word. 30 paces down the ridge trail, near a clump of cholla, he found the mother. She was crumpled in the mud, half covered by a wool blanket soaked through. Fever had her, her skin flushed, sweat beading even as the cold gnawed at her. Silas crouched down, brushed matted hair from her face. There was a deep cut on her side, black around the edges. "Infected. She ain't eaten in 2 days," the girl said, standing behind him like a ghost. "She got cut bad crossing the arroyo." Silas grunted. No time for questions. He hoisted the woman in both arms, light as dry brush, and carried her back toward the cabin. The girl followed silently. Inside, he laid the woman on the cot. The fire had all but died, so he threw in fresh wood, then poured a cup of kerosene on it for good measure. Flames leapt to life. In the flicker, the woman's face looked carved from wax. He rolled up his sleeves. "I ain't done this in a decade," he said more to himself than anyone else. "But you ain't dying under my roof." His hands were surprisingly steady. He cleaned the wound with whiskey, boiled his old bone needle in a kettle, and sewed the gash tight. She didn't wake, didn't scream. Her breathing came in shallow gasps. Her skin radiated heat. The girl watched from the corner, still hugging herself. "What's her name?" Silas asked without looking up. "Emmeline," she said. "You?" "Lottie Mae." He grunted again. Names. Didn't matter. Not out here. The work took hours. He crushed up old herbs, a poultice made from pine tar and honey, and packed the wound. When he was finished, he sat back, drenched in sweat and grime, the cabin thick with the scent of blood, smoke, and rain. That's when he noticed the calluses. The woman's hands, limp on the blanket, had rough pads on the tips. Not just from labor, trigger fingers. And on her ankle, just above the boot line, was a mark, a brand. Small but unmistakable, the coiled rattler of the Crossburg gang. His gut clenched. Memories flared. He'd seen that mark 10 years ago on a man he left choking on his own teeth near El Paso. Bad people. Worse than rumors made them. He glanced at the girl again. She was warming her hands by the fire now, watching him with a stillness too deep for her age. "You sure she's your mama?" he asked, voice low. The girl didn't flinch. "I'm sure. She always carry iron." Lottie looked up at him. Her face was blank, but her eyes. "She carries what she has to," she said. Silas leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. Something in his chest, an old ache, an itch he couldn't scratch, came back to life. The silence returned, heavier now. It pressed on the room like a weight. He poured 2 fingers of whiskey and offered it to the girl. She didn't move. "She asleep?" she asked, nodding toward Emmeline. "For now. You think she'll die?" Silas stared into the glass. "I've seen worse live. And better die." Lottie nodded slowly. "You got a Bible?" He pointed with his chin to a dusty one on the shelf. "Ain't opened it in a while." "Can I?" He shrugged. "It's yours if it helps." She rose and walked over to it. Didn't blow the dust. Just opened it to the middle and stared. "What do you do out here all alone?" she asked after a while. "Try not to remember things," he said. She nodded like she understood. "You ever kill anyone?" Silas looked at her sharply. Lottie didn't look back. "Mama says sometimes killing's the only way out of certain holes." He didn't answer. The fire crackled. The storm outside softened to a whisper. Later, when the girl was curled up on a pile of blankets, Silas sat by the fire, staring into the flames. He didn't sleep. He never really did. Too many voices in the dark. But this time, one of those voices was real. Behind him, Lottie's soft whisper. "Thank you, Mr. Granger." He didn't turn around. "Don't thank me yet, girl," he said. "We ain't made it to morning." The wind had softened to a sigh by morning, but the chill lingered, seeping through every crack in the log walls. The fire was burning low, casting a flickering orange glow across the floorboards. Silas sat with his back to the hearth, his knees drawn up, whittling a twig to a fine point. Outside, snow had dusted the canyon rim, a rare sight this far south, even in winter. A cough from the cot broke the quiet, wet and shallow. Then a whisper. "Preacher." Silas stiffened. The name hung in the air like smoke, as if spoken by the fire itself. He turned slowly. Emmeline lay half-propped on the blanket-stuffed cot, eyes glazed with fever. Her lips trembled. She was looking straight through him, past the room, through time. "Preacher," she mumbled again. "Ain't no light in here. Ain't no light." He rose, cautious, wary of ghosts not his own. "You know me?" he asked. Her head lolled. Her eyes fluttered closed, then snapped open. "I seen you before the chapel burned. You didn't kill me." Silas's jaw clenched. She was younger then, just another face in the firelight, in the smoke and chaos of Sabine Ridge. Her voice carried the echo of gunfire. A girl among men, the flames licking the walls of that church. He'd stood over her with a pistol drawn. She'd looked up at him, defiant, bleeding from the scalp. And he'd walked away. "You were a kid," he muttered now. "I don't kill children." "I wasn't no child," she whispered. "And you weren't no preacher." She slumped back into unconsciousness, sweat beading at her temple. Silas didn't move for a long time, just stood there, breathing the heavy air, the stink of infection and smoke, the weight of a name he hadn't worn since that night. He turned toward the fire again and sat down with a groan. His hands shook slightly as he resumed his carving. Lottie sat across from him, cross-legged on the floor, studying the worn handle of his knife. She hadn't said a word during her mother's ramblings. Her face was unreadable, a mask too old for her small frame. "Want to learn how to sharpen this proper?" he asked. She nodded once. He handed her the blade and the stone, watching her hands move with the awkward care of someone used to doing things wrong but determined not to. "You always live alone?" she asked. He leaned his head back against the logs. "Not always. Not by choice, neither." "Why now?" Silas looked at the ceiling like it might offer an answer. "Because I done too many things I can't ever undo." Lottie didn't say anything for a while. The blade scraped softly against the whetstone. Then she looked up, eyes shining in the firelight. "What if you had one more chance?" He let the question settle like dust. "Ain't how the world works, girl." Some things don't get no do-overs. Lottie didn't push. She just went back to sharpening. The day passed slow. Silas fed Emmeline broth with a bent spoon, wiped her brow with a damp rag. She drifted in and out of dreams, sometimes calling him preacher, sometimes speaking names he didn't know. He caught a few. Holt Delaboon. Gang names, maybe. Old wounds. By afternoon, the sun peeked through the clouds, pale and cold as a dead man's eye. Silas stepped outside to split firewood before nightfall. He moved stiffly, the cold biting his joints, his breath fogging the air. He lined up a thick log and brought the axe down with a grunt. When he bent to stack the pieces, something caught his eye. Tracks. Boot prints. Deep and wide. Headed toward the back of the cabin, and then back again. Too big for Emmeline or Lottie. Fresh. He turned slowly, scanning the ridgeline. The canyon beyond was silent. Just snow and stone and silence. But something crawled under his skin. He checked the perimeter. One of his traps, an old snare tucked behind a juniper, had been triggered, but it was reset clean. No catch. No blood. No disturbance. Someone had touched it, and they knew what they were doing. That night, he bolted the door and wedged a chair under the handle. When he lay down, he slid his revolver beneath the cot, grip facing out. Sleep came in fits. He dreamt of Sabine Ridge, the chapel ablaze, smoke choking the rafters, screams echoing off the stone walls. His hand steady, his eyes burning, blood on the altar. A woman sobbing behind a pew, the preacher's collar around his neck, soaked through with sweat and gore. Orders given, then ignored. He'd spared the girl. And for what? He woke before dawn, breath shallow, shirt soaked through. The fire had died to coals. And there she was, Lottie, crouched in front of his chest, the heavy iron box that held his past. She didn't flinch when he sat up. "You find what you were looking for?" he asked, voice a rasp. She looked over her shoulder. "Just looking at." He said nothing. She stood and shut the lid, slowly, as if it might bite her. "You got a lot of guns," she said. "I got a lot of history," he replied. Lottie didn't move. "Are they all from people you killed?" "Some," he said. "Some from folks who tried to kill me." She nodded once, then turned and crawled back to her corner. Silas stared at the chest. Inside were more than weapons. Letters, maps, a Bible with his name burned off, a Confederate medal he never wore, the broken chain of a pocket watch, proof of who he'd been, of what he'd done, of what he might still be. He leaned over, pulled the revolver from beneath the cot, and held it for a moment. Heavy, cold, familiar. Then he closed his eyes and listened. The girl had started humming, soft and low, a tune he didn't recognize, but there was something in it, a sadness too deep for her years, the kind of sound that didn't come from childhood but from pain, carved into the bones by time and loss. He lay back, revolver on his chest, and waited for morning. The wind had died entirely, leaving a silence so dense it pressed against the walls of the cabin. The fire crackled low in the hearth, licking shadows across the plank floor. Silas sat in his rocker, revolver balanced on his lap, listening. Not for coyotes or thunder, for something heavier. Human footsteps. Breath held just a little too long. The absence of natural sound. It was after midnight when the door exploded inward. The hinges screamed as three figures burst through, mud-spattered boots, long coats dripping from melted snow, bandanas hiding every face but the eyes. Each carried iron. One had a shotgun, the others revolvers. All of them moved like they'd done this before. Quick, efficient. Silas raised his revolver instinctively, but stopped dead. Lottie stood by the hearth, unmoving. Emmeline had risen from the cot, pale and swaying, but very much awake. Neither of them looked surprised. Neither of them screamed. Emmeline's voice came first, soft but sharp enough to cut through the smoke. "Sorry, old man. You're just the last marker we had to collect." Silas didn't lower his gun. Didn't raise it, either. He looked from her to the girl, then to the outlaws fanning out across the room, like hungry wolves. "I figured something stank," he said quietly. "Didn't know it was you." Emmeline coughed, wiping sweat from her brow. You should have finished what you started in Sabine Ridge. But maybe some part of you wanted this. One of the men stepped forward, yanked down his bandana. Face young, eyes full of hate. You remember Avery? The man growled. General Thomas Avery? Union flag waving over his bones. Silas's stomach turned to iron. Yeah, he said. I remember. I'm his son. Silas gave a slow nod. Then you're the boy who cried beside his grave with a knife tucked in your boot. Cal Avery's nostrils flared. And now I'm the man who'll put you in one. The next moment happened all at once. The outlaw on the right moved toward Silas, raising his pistol. But Silas didn't hesitate. The boot knife he always kept sheathed along his calf flashed upward. He kicked it free, snatched it mid-air, and drove it clean into the man's gut. A sound like tearing cloth, and the man collapsed, gasping, red spilling fast. Avery roared and fired. The shot went wide, shattering a lantern on the wall. The cabin flared into chaos. Silas rolled behind the table as a second shot splintered the chair where he'd just been sitting. Emmeline shouted something, unclear in the ringing silence. Lottie crouched low, face blank, crawling toward the shelves. The third man moved toward the door, flanking. Silas spun out from cover and fired once, hit him in the shoulder. The outlaw screamed and dropped his gun, clutching the wound. Stay down. Silas barked. The man didn't listen. Lottie stood suddenly, hands trembling, and threw something into the fire. A full oil lantern. It shattered against the stones, with a flash of blue fire. Flames leapt up the log wall, hungry and fast. You stupid little! Emmeline shouted, lunging toward the girl. Lottie backed away. You said no killing, she screamed. You said. Silas didn't wait to hear more. He grabbed Emmeline by the wrist and shoved her toward the door. Out, both of you! The wounded outlaw staggered back, tripping over the broken table. Cal Avery was crouched near the hearth, gun raised, teeth clenched. You ain't walking out of here, Granger. Then neither are you. Silas snapped, and hurled the blade again. It struck Avery in the thigh. The man collapsed with a cry, gun clattering from his fingers. Smoke filled the room. The fire had climbed halfway up the wall, flames dancing toward the rafters. Silas ran to the cot, pulled out his old pack, and grabbed the last of his ammo. Tucked it into his belt. The air was thick, suffocating. Visibility was dropping fast. He turned, found Emmeline and Lottie at the threshold, both coughing. You wanted me dead, he growled. Then get out and tell the rest of I'm still breathing. Emmeline's eyes burned. We were sent. All of us. Not for revenge. Not for gold. For your name. Silas shoved her out the door. The night air hit like salvation, cold and clean. Behind him, Avery crawled toward his pistol, dragging his leg. Silas kicked it away, dragged him by the collar out into the snow. The flames behind them lit the canyon with an orange glow. The cabin crackled, popping with stored memories. Inside, shadows twisted, too many ghosts to count. Silas dropped Avery into the snow. Who? He asked. Who paid? Avery spat blood. You're already dead, Granger. Words out, price on your soul. There'll be more. Hell, some of them will come just for the story. Silas crouched low, stared into the younger man's face. You came here thinking I was some broken relic, but I ain't forgotten what I was trained to do. Avery didn't speak again. Silas raised the revolver and ended it clean. The report echoed through the canyon like a thunderclap. He stood for a moment in the stillness, watching the fire consume his cabin, watching the years burn down, watching the place where he'd hidden and healed and waited collapse into ash. Behind him, Emmeline cradled Lottie, both of them too tired to run, too raw to speak. Silas didn't look at them. He walked back into the firelight, searching for whatever hadn't yet been burned.